So hello, everybody. We are going to start in 1 minute. So good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, everyone. Thank you for being with us. Welcome to this webinar on the potential and opportunities of nitrogen stabilizers, also known as urease and nitrification inhibitors. And it's interesting to look at the potential and opportunities of these products in order to manage nitrogen in agri-food systems and to do that as efficiently as possible. So my name is Patrick Effer. I am the Deputy Director General of the International Fertilizer Association. In a few words, we are a body representing globally plant nutrition solutions providers. We have about 500 members in 80 countries. Our mission is to help feed the world sustainably. So we have two pillars: providing enough nutrients to feed the world and doing that as sustainably as possible. And in relation to sustainability, one of the priorities is to decarbonize our industry. Decarbonize production, fertilizer production, and decarbonize fertilizer use. So today, the focus will be on fertilizer use and to minimize, especially nitrous oxide, so N2O emissions. There are a number of interventions that will help us really to reduce our greenhouse gas footprint. The first one is to improve nitrogen use efficiency at the farm through best management practices, using the 4 R's, so using the right nutrient source at the right rate, at the right time, in the right place. But we can also, improve nutrient use efficiency and reduce greenhouse gas emissions through the use of inhibitors and also controlled release fertilizers. Last year, we issued a report that was, commissioned by IFA and authored by Systemic, and which shows that about 60% of the N2O emissions could be, avoided if we if farmers were using, best management practices, so the 4 R's, or using inhibitors and control release fertilizers. So today, the market for stabilized fertilizers with inhibitors is relatively small. We are talking about a global market of roughly 10 million tons in product terms, which is 4 to 5% of the global nitrogen fertilizer market. So that's about, that's really a small market share. And the bulk of that market is in North America. At IFA, we estimate that about 60% of the stabilized fertilizers are used in North America. The other regions that use these products are East Asia, Latin America, and Western and Central Europe. In North America, that's really can go up to 20, 1/4 of the nitrogen fertilizers that is used in the form of stabilized fertilizers with inhibitors. So today, during our webinar, we will look at what are inhibitors, looking at the two different categories, urease and nitrification inhibitors. There will be presentations about their potential to minimize nitrogen losses, especially ammonia and nitrous oxide emissions, how to use them safely, and options to stimulate as well wider adoption, like is the case already in North America, but we need wider adoption in the rest of the world. So for this, we have 6 speakers today. So the first speaker will be Hakim Doberman, who is a chief scientist at IFA. Then we will have Matthias Ruffo, who is director of agronomy for Latin America and Sub-Saharan Africa at Koch Agronomic Services. Matthias is based in Uruguay and Argentina. Then we have Gregor Pazda, who is Global Technical Manager at BASF in Germany. We'll then have Klaus Butterbach-Ball, Professor at the Department of Agroecology at the Aarhus University, and he also heads the Center for Landscapes Research in Sustainable Agricultural Futures. We have then Thomas Lepin, Head of Regulatory Affairs at Compo Expert. And finally, we would have David Cantor, Associate Professor at New York University, and also Chairman of the International Nitrogen Initiative. So we have a blend of academic and industry speakers. So with this, I would like to invite all the participants, and I'm glad to say, to inform you that more than 400 people have registered. So for the time being, 150 of you have, let's say, already joined the webinar. So we won't make the last part of the webinar interactive. So we would like to invite you to ask questions to the speakers. For that purpose, we invite you to use the Q&A function. Avoid as much as possible to use the chat function for that. Finally, the webinar will be recorded. So if colleagues of yours are interested, please share the link for, let's say, watching the replay in the coming days. With this, I would like to invite now our first speaker. That's Achim Dobermann, and Achim is going to, let's say, provide a general overview on managing nitrogen in agri-food systems. So over to you, Achim.
I cannot share yet.
Yes, I have to stop sharing my screen up. Over to you now.
Okay, this should be hopefully there.
It is, yes. If you can put it.
Good afternoon, everybody. So I just want to very briefly at the beginning position the role of inhibitors as one of many solutions within the general challenge of managing nitrogen in agri-food systems. And for that, it often helps to take a look at the complexity of nutrient flows in agri-food systems. So that would apply to nitrogen, but also other mineral elements. Yeah. And from the manufacturing of nutrients on the fertilizer side all the way to the consumption by humans, you can see we have a complex system. But the point I really want to make is that perhaps when it particularly comes also to fertilizers and inhibitors, the most important component of that is the cropland component, because that is where the bulk of the freshly entering nutrients into the agri-food chain are being applied. Of course, some goes into grasslands too, but the bulk as fertilizers, also as nitrogen fixation from legumes, goes here into the cropland, and livestock manure, a lot of it also comes back to here. Yeah. So really what we do in terms of managing nutrients in this component of the total nitrogen system is having huge impacts on the overall efficiency of the system, but it's not, of course, the only component. When you put some numbers on that, just looking at the cropland nitrogen balance now here, you can see that we have the 5 major input components, and they add up to about 158 million tons of nitrogen each year, and more than half of that coming from mineral fertilizer alone. And we're removing over 100 million tons with the crop on a global scale every year. We therefore have a surplus of over 80 million tons, or a little over 50 kilogram nitrogen every hectare cropland each year, and an efficiency of 55%. But what we also want to point out here is that in addition to that simple partial balance calculation, we have over 50 million tons of nitrogen being lost as volatilization or gathers emissions in various forms, or leaching. And a lot of these environmental losses are a target also for the use of nitrogen inhibitors. Reducing them becomes very important in relation to global climate change mitigation, but also other environmental targets on the biodiversity management side, for example. So we have on a global scale made some progress in improving nitrogen use efficiency on cropland. So we had a low of 43% in the late 1980s, and it has steadily increased to about 55% now. And I think we should be able to reach about 70% on a global average scale by 2040 if we accelerate this progress a little bit more. But we still have a lot of surplus, 80 to 85 million tons each year. It's worth pointing out that nearly 2/3 of that surplus is happening in Asia, particularly China and India. Yeah. So 50 million tons alone, and that's where we really need to also address the issue. Yeah. But as Patrick has mentioned, on top of that general quest for improving the nitrogen efficiency in the system, we need to have specific solutions that also then address mitigation or reducing greenhouse gas emissions that are related with the use of fertilizer. We published this report that Patrick mentioned 2 years ago, where we specifically looked at that. And the finding of this report was that we have about 700 million tons of CO2 equivalent greenhouse gas emissions happening at the application end of fertilizer. So what we call scope 3 emissions happening in the farm, basically. Most of that is nitrous oxide, a very potent greenhouse gas. And as was mentioned already, a significant amount of this can be mitigated by practices that in general increase nitrogen use efficiency, or by the application of different types of inhibitors. So this is really the potential that we have here from a greenhouse gas point of view, in addition to the other targets of reducing environmental losses and increasing nitrogen use efficiency, and therefore also benefits for producers. How that actually works, what types of inhibitors we have, how they work, and what needs to be considered for the future is what the next speakers are going to address. Thank you.
So thank you, Hakim, and thank you for highlighting 2 projects in which IFA is involved. The FAO-STAT Cropland Nutrient Budget Database, which was launched about now 2 years ago, and that's a great partnership. And the other one was his report with Systemic about how to reduce emission from fertilizer use. So now let's the different inhibitors category more in depth, and what are the characteristics, what are their mode of action, also what are the economic, environmental, and economic benefits, and the development of new products. So we'll start with urease inhibitors, and so Matthias, you are going to present on the topic. Over to you, Matthias.
Can you hear me okay? Can you hear me okay, Patrick?
Yes, we can hear you, and we see your slides. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Pleasure to be here in this webinar. Let's jump to the topic of the problem we're trying to solve here, which is ammonia volatilization. When urea or urea-containing fertilizers like UAN are applied to the soil surface, some of that nitrogen gets lost to the atmosphere by ammonia volatilization. This is a relatively complex process. I'm not going to go in depth into it, but it starts when the urease enzyme hydrolyzes urea. In this process, there's a consumption of protons that increase the pH around the granule, and that triggers or favors the formation of ammonia in the ammonia-ammonium equilibrium in the soil. As I mentioned, urease enzyme is a key factor in this process, and it's freely available in the soil, but it's produced by bacteria, fungi, and plants, and it's rarely a limiting factor in the hydrolysis of urea that we're facing. Ammonia volatilization is, as it was mentioned and will be mentioned later, a serious problem affecting nitrogen use efficiency. There are different estimates. One of the estimates that is available for surface applied urea estimated a 31% loss of nitrogen when urea is surface applied, and that value can reach up to 40 or 60% under some conditions. Something that is important to remember is that this ammonia volatilization loss can occur very rapidly under right conditions. And let me show you an example of that coming from Brazil. Here in this figure, we'll see on the vertical axis the percent of the nitrogen applied lost to the atmosphere as a percent of the nitrogen applied as ammonia, nitrogen, for different levels of residue. Regardless of the level of residue, we can see that in just 2 days, that nitrogen loss is pretty much maximized. And as we increase the amount of residue over the soil, the ammonia volatilization loss is increased. This was done under field conditions, jumping from 30% to 60%, as I mentioned, that can be found or happen in some areas. So a process that can happen very quickly, and we need to address. Residue cover is one of the factors that affect volatilization. There are many factors. I'm not going to go in depth into this, but something just to point out a few ones that are critical. One of those is the nitrogen rate. Some farmers, some people tend to increase the nitrogen application rate to compensate for the ammonia volatilization loss. And that's a bad idea. It's an inefficient use of the fertilizer because this increases ammonia volatilization, not only in the absolute number in kilos of N per hectare, but also as a percent of the nitrogen applied. So not a good idea. Environmental factors, there are several that affect volatilization. A key one is soil pH. Soil pH affects the equilibrium between ammonia and ammonium. And as soil pH increases, volatilization increases as well. So we can expect more losses in alkaline soils. That doesn't mean that we are not going to see losses in acid soils. The slide I showed before had a soil pH of 5.4, but it increases with soil pH. And temperature, of course, as any biological process, temperature affects volatilization. It increases with temperature increases as well. That doesn't mean also that in winter crops, we're not going to see volatilization. That's also important to remember. Volatilization has double effects. One, on the one hand, affecting productivity of different crops. Here we have a couple of examples of quantitative measurements of the impact of volatilization on crop productivity. On the left, on sugarcane, where the researchers estimated a loss of almost half a ton of sugarcane per kilo of N lost. And on the right, on pastures, so clearly an effect on productivity, on farmer economics, and inefficient use of fertilizer. And as it was mentioned before, there's an effect or impact of volatilization on the environment, both directly affecting air quality through the direct emission of ammonia, and also indirectly impacting nitrous oxide emissions that are coming from this ammonia being lost. So what is the solution to this problem? The technological solution is the use of urease inhibitors. Urease inhibitors are substances that inhibit the activity of the urease enzyme that I mentioned is a key component in this process. And then the end result of these urease inhibitors is the reduction of ammonia volatilization. What are urease inhibitors more colloquially speaking? These are chemical compounds that provide chemical protection. They act on the urease that is in the soil, and most typically they are impregnated to the urea. They're coated into urea. There are some products in which the urease inhibitors are incorporated during urea production, but most commonly they are impregnated to urea. In the marketplace, there's a lot of confusion because farmers see a urea now that has some color, and they think that it's a polymer providing physical protection, and that's not the case. Urease inhibitors are typically can provide chemical protection, and they don't act on urea. They go with urea or UAN as well. There are some products that apply to UAN. As it was mentioned before, the two countries that have the highest adoption of urease inhibitors are the US and Brazil. And in these two countries, there are three compounds that are recognized as urease inhibitors: MBPT, MPPT, and duramide. As you can see, for example, AFCO in the US recognized MBPT as a urease inhibitor in 1997. This has been widely adopted globally and is the most widely adopted urease inhibitor in the world. How does it work? Going to the mode of action, very quickly said, this is the molecule of a representation of the molecule of MBPT. This part of the molecule resembles urea and is able to interact with the urease active site, inhibiting its action. So it competes with urea for the active site of the enzyme, and in that competition, it slows down hydrolysis and reduces ammonia volatilization. This is what we call competitive inhibition. By competing with urea for the active site of the enzyme, it reduces the rate of hydrolysis and consequently volatilization. As I mentioned, MBPT has been available in the world for quite some time, and there's a lot of research supporting its efficacy. This is one of those pieces of research, a meta-analysis of 35 studies in which Silva and co-workers reported a 52% reduction in volatilization for urea treated with MBPT in comparison to untreated urea, and also a delay in these losses, which is very important from a management point of view. In a similar companion study, Cantarella from Brazil, we reported a relatively similar value for the reduction of volatilization losses with MBPT and showed a consistent performance both under field and lab conditions as a urease inhibitor for this compound. So clearly proven efficacy to reduce ammonia volatilization. But that's not the only benefit of urease inhibitors. Urease inhibitors also reduce nitrous oxide emissions, N2 emissions. In a publication by Lee and co-workers, they reported in this meta-analysis almost 21% reduction in N2O emissions on average around of 20 trials, as well as a slightly higher reduction in ammonia volatilization. So clearly here we see one of the benefits of this technology, which is to reduce emissions both of ammonia and nitrous oxide. I'm not going to go deeper into nitrous oxide. It's going to be the topic of a later on presentation in this webinar. But there were some conversations previously about the adoption for farmers, and it's going to be a topic of other presentations. And I believe a key driver for this to be adopted globally and massively around the world is to show yield benefits. And this same meta-analysis showed an average yield increase across many crops and many countries in the world of 6.2% for yield on average around of 240 trials. So clearly a benefit for the farmer, yield increases, and at the same time, a reduction in emissions of ammonia and nitrous oxide. But MBPT is not free of challenges. There are some conditions that provide a challenge for MBPT. For example, acid soils or higher temperatures. These conditions are challenging for the efficacy of this inhibitor, and the industry has been working on developing next generation urease inhibitors. One of those is Duramide, was developed by Koch Agronomic Services. Here is a representation of the Duramide molecule, and as you can see, it's a more complex molecule than MBPT, and this makes it more stable under different range of environmental conditions. This next generation urease inhibitor, as I mentioned, was recognized by AFCO as a urease inhibitor, as well as by MAPA in Brazil. And it's available commercially in a formulation that is combined with MBPT. And this combination of Duramide plus MBPT results in a more effective urease inhibition and reduction in volatilization than MBPT alone. In fact, a recently published paper by Kasim and co-workers recognized or concluded that Duramide plus MBPT reduced ammonia losses by up to 33% in comparison to MBPT alone. Also, it provides a longer window of protection against ammonia losses and was designed for greater stability, and also it achieves an enhanced shelf life on treated urea. So how does this formulation work? As I said, it has two active ingredients, MBPT providing immediate protection against volatilization right after the application, and then Duramide, which is a more stable urease inhibitor, slowly converts to MBPT, maintaining that MBPT concentration in the soil, that inhibition for longer, which results in a longer lasting protection and more efficacy in the reduction of ammonia volatilization, especially in challenging environments. Let me show you some examples here. On the vertical axis, here we have the percent of N loss of ammonia, percent of nitrogen applied loss as ammonia for the same soil with two different pHs. So same soil, same texture, pH of 5 and 6.5. For untreated urea treated with MBPT in the light green, and then urea treated with Duramide and MBPT in the dark green. As you can see, regardless of the soil pH, Duramide plus MBPT provided losses or reduced losses to a level of 5% or less, whereas when we are in a almost neutral soil, MBPT performed quite well, but as we move to the more acidic soil, its efficacy gets reduced and resulting in 10% losses of ammonia. Same thing or something similar happens with temperature. As I mentioned, a challenging environment. And as we know, temperature increases volatilization. This is the same soil at 2 different temperatures, an incubation study, lab study, 28 Celsius and 38 Celsius. And as you can see, clearly with Duramide and MBPT, there is a consistent efficacy in the reduction of ammonia volatilization of almost 80% reduction. But as we go from the lower temperature, 28 Celsius, to the higher temperature of 38 Celsius, MBPT reduce its efficacy. So as a result of this more effective performance of Duramide plus MBPT across environments, we're seeing great results all over the world. Just to show some examples of trials conducted in more temperate conditions, different 8 trials on average, the average of 8 trials conducted in different states in the US across 4 different nitrogen rates for untreated urea and Duramide plus MBPT treated urea. We can see in every nitrogen rate a yield increase with this urease inhibitor, consistent performance across N rates. So whatever you're managing your nitrogen with respect to nitrogen rate, you can expect a yield increase based on these results under these nitrogen responsive conditions. And on average, we saw a yield increase of 1.9 tons per hectare on corn on average across these 8 locations. Not only in the US, we're seeing great results, also more diverse cropping systems as well. This is an example of results that we're seeing in Brazil for Duramide plus MBPT in comparison to urea in Brazil with the various different conditions than the one I just showed you in the US, where we have yield increases for winter crops of 6.8% in southern Brazil and annual crops. Also summer crops like cotton, rice, or corn, very significant yield increases and very important return on investments for the farmers, as well as in perennial crops with very different management practices like coffee or pasture. So overall, very good results for urease inhibitors, and in particular in this case for Duramide plus MBPT. Just to summarize some ideas, I have shown you how the urease inhibitors are a proven tool to reduce ammonia volatilization and increase yield with very clear mode of action, very documented for urease inhibitors with a competing inhibition. They're also very easy to use. Farmers can use the same application method they're using for the regular fertilizer. And very importantly, these urease inhibitors provide win-win results. Not only they increase yield, as I have shown, but also they reduce emissions of ammonia and nitrous oxide, both directly and indirectly through the reduction of ammonia emissions as well. So here we have a technology that provides these dual benefits, both for the farmer and for the environment. And there are very few technologies that can do that. Nitrification inhibitors are also provide the same benefits, dual benefits. Just to conclude very quickly, a list of the references I use here. I know you're not going to be able to take notes of this, but the webinar is being recorded, so people can take a look at this. And then I thank you for your attention and my contact information in case you want to direct any questions to me. Thank you, Patrick.
Thank you very much, Matthias. Very informative presentation. And it's great to see that there are new molecules coming as well that can help improve the, let's say, the efficiency of urease inhibitors. And so that's great developments. So now let's move to the second presenter. That will be, let's say, the third one about nitrification inhibitors. That will be Gregor Pazda. So yes, Matthias, that's good. You have closed your, stop sharing your screen. So Gregor?
Yep.
Yes. Will you share your screen? Perfect. So over to you, Gregor.
Thank you, Patrick. So why this doesn't work?
Oh, it works. We can hear you and we can see you.
Okay, hello everybody. So on the first slide shows a very, very simple nitrogen cycle. You know that the fertilizer industry uses elemental nitrogen from the air to produce mineral fertilizers, and these mineral fertilizer differs in nitrogen forms. Fertilizers contain urea, nitrogen as urea, and or ammonium, and or as a nitrate, and we also have fertilizers from animal husbandry which contain organic nitrogen. And you see here with the brown bars that all these nitrogen forms are transformed in the soil into other nitrogen forms, and that we have during these processes nitrogen losses. And Matthias already pointed out that during the transformation of urea, we have nitrogen losses in form of ammonia. And the International Panel of Climate Change is calculating these losses with, on average, 15% of the applied nitrogen for pure urea as ammonia nitrogen. And this ammonium from urea, but also from ammonium-containing fertilizers, for example, from ammonium sulfate, but also from organic fertilizer, is then transformed in the soil process called nitrification into nitrate. And the nitrate is then transformed in the soil process of denitrification in nitrous oxide and other nitrous oxides form, and at the end in elemental nitrogen, which is then available for the fertilizer producer. So the nitrogen cycle is closed. And in both soil process, nitrification inhibitor and denitrification inhibitor, we have losses in form of nitrous oxide, and IPCC is calculating on average of losses of 1% of the applied nitrogen in form of nitrous oxide nitrogen. And everybody knows that nitrate can be leached out from the root horizon at the end into the groundwater. And here IPCC is calculating as a rough figure with on average 12% informed us about the effects of urease inhibitors to reduce ammonia losses from urea-containing fertilizers. And in my talk, I will focus on nitrification inhibitors, which reduce N losses in form of N2O and nitrate. So first, some information about the mode of action. So nitrification inhibitors retard the naturally occurring transformation of ammonium into nitrate by selectively inhibiting the activity of very specific nitrifying bacteria. So these are the Nitrosomonas bacteria over a period of 4 to 10 weeks. And in detail, it is the first step of the nitrification process from ammonium into nitrate. So this step is inhibited for a certain period of time. And on this slide, I summarized all the effects of nitrification inhibitors. I already mentioned that we reduced N losses in form of nitrate leaching, as well as in form of N2O emissions. So due to the reduction of N losses, we have more nitrogen for the crop, which increases nitrogen use efficiency. And due to a high nitrogen use efficiency, we have with fertilizers with nitrification inhibitor a higher yield compared to the same fertilizer untreated. Here on the right-hand side, you see some figures concerning the yield increase of a fertilizer treated with a nitrification inhibitor compared to the untreated fertilizer. The other effect of an increased nitrogen use efficiency is that you have the same yield level as nitrogen fertilizer without nitrification inhibitor, but with a lower nitrogen amount. And this effect is very important for all locations with restricted nitrogen amounts. For example, the red zones in Germany. Besides the reduction of the nitrogen losses, I would to point out one very interesting topic, and this is the better phosphate and trace element nutrition due to the partly ammonium nutrition with nitrification inhibitors. This is shown in this nice pot experiments. So if you have an ammonium-containing fertilizer with nitrification inhibitor, the transformation of ammonium into nitrate is inhibited for a certain period of time. So the plants are forced to take up the nitrogen in ammonium form, which results in a release of protons, and these protons will acidify the rhizosphere, which can increase the plant availability of phosphate and some trace elements. And this is shown here in this pot experiment. We have here the control treatment, only nitrate-containing fertilizer without any phosphate fertilizer. Then here also only nitrate-containing fertilizer, but with fertilized in addition with rock phosphate, which has no water-soluble phosphate, and you see no effect of the phosphate fertilizer. Then ammonium sulfate nitrate, a fertilizer containing ammonium nitrogen, and you see here a significant increase in biomass. And then here the same fertilizer, ASN, treated with a nitrification inhibitor, we have a further significant yield increase. And we have the same yield level, let's say, as the second control, poor nitrate containing fertilizer, but fertilized with superphosphate, which contains only 100% water-soluble phosphate. So same effect, but here in the case of rock phosphate with a cheaper phosphate source. I would like to point out also to this meta-analysis from Lee et al., which focus on this topic. I already mentioned that nitrification inhibitors reduce direct as well as indirect N2O emissions. And you know that N2O is the most worst greenhouse gas because its global warming potential is nearly 300 times higher compared to CO2. And agriculture, and especially the mineral as well as the organic nitrogen fertilization, is the major source of N2O. So a farmer has different possibilities to adapt his farm management to reduce N2O emissions. And here on the left side, these different measures are mentioned. And Gradus et al. From the Aarhus University, they compared these different measures and evaluated it. And you see we have here some blue bars, which means we have here with this measure a significant reduction of N2O emissions. We have yellow bars, no change, and red bars with a significant increase of N2O emissions. And if we now look on nitrification inhibitors, you see only a significant reduction, and the effect size is quite high compared to other fertilizers. So the key message is, compared to other measures, nitrification inhibitors are the most efficient, and what is important, the most efficient plug-and-play solution to reduce N2O emissions. And here an example of a 3-year field experiments comparing fertilizer without the nitrification inhibitor DNPP with the same carrier fertilizer treated with DNPP. And you see here on average, we have a reduction by nearly 50%. So nitrogen inhibitors, meaning urease inhibitors as well as nitrification inhibitors, are a triple win for farmers, society, and industry. So for the farmer, he has a significant return on investment. He can reduce his CO2 footprint for his produced products. Also, farm management can be simplified, and he's prepared for future regulatory requirements. For the society, due to the reduction of nitrogen losses, we have better air and water quality. The climate impact of agriculture is significantly reduced, and also the biodiversity is improved. And last but not least, we also have a win situation for the fertilizer industry. You can show that you are innovative if you use fertilizer with nitrogen inhibitors. You can differentiate against the competition. You can reduce your CO2 footprint, and you are also prepared for future regulatory requirements. Thanks a lot.
So thanks a lot, Gregor. Very good presentation as well. So now let's move to, let's say, the potential of inhibitors, whether that's urease or nitrification inhibitors, as, let's say, an effective solutions for minimizing greenhouse gas emissions from fertilizer use. So Klaus, you will share some insight with us on the topic. Over to you, Klaus.
Yes, thanks a lot, Patrick, for the introduction. Yeah, so I think a lot of things have said already. We all know that nitrogen losses to the environment are of huge societal concern, and possibly inhibitors can indeed be part of the solution here. So if you see this diagram, which you have seen in different forms as well, you see we deal with a rather complex nitrogen cycling in the soil as well as effects to the environment. The most important things for us in this regard are the losses of nitrogen compounds to the environment. On the one hand, of course, the greenhouse gas effect, what Gregor was talking about in form of N2O. But there is even more. There is as well the atmospheric chemistry affected and the eutrophication potential of ammonia emissions or even NO losses from the soil to the atmosphere. So just as a side note, agricultural soil contribute approximately 10% to the NOx loading of the troposphere, which again enhance the ozone loading as well. On the other hand, as well, we talked about it as well a bit and indicated there's a problem with nitrogen leaching, which as well affect human health as well as the eutrophication potential of river and the sea. So what we can do and what we know now, and I think we can be rather confident of that one, is that nitrification as well as urease inhibitors reduce soil NO and N2O emissions due to the effect that we are blocking or at least reducing the nitrification in the soil. So the interesting part of that one is we can go for various meta-analysis, and I come back to that later on. Yes, we see something, and indeed this is very significant in all the cases, but we see as well a little bit of a variability. So it's not that we can directly put a number here that if we use nitrification inhibitors, we will always see a reduction of 30 or 40% of the N2O emission or NO emissions or nitrogen leaching. So I just show you here an example of a colleague of mine, of Søren Petersen, who has worked on that for many years, and he's also from Aarhus University. On the one hand, you see here is the observational data for spring barley, the vegetation period. And you see once we apply the inhibitors, you see a significant, in most cases, a significant reduction of the N2O emission. This is even more pronounced if you apply slurry. So if you put an inhibitor to the slurry before applying it. However, this is the year 2020. If you go to the year 2021, the picture looks different. Again, we see in general a trend towards reduction of N2O emissions, but not always it's significant. And for slurry as well, we get rather mixed results. Where does this all come from? One thing we should not forget is about that it really depends on the soil types. If we have soils which drain well, nitrification inhibitors work better as compared to soils which are possibly have a higher clay content and therefore a higher soil moisture one. And another one is as well weather condition in a given year. So this really matters if we have a more dry soil or if you have a more wet soil and if the temperatures are high or if they are lower. So we have significant effects of nitrification inhibitors. But the fertilizer type matters. It's not only comparing here inorganic and organic fertilizers, but also among the different inorganic fertilizers or synthetic fertilizers, as well as weather conditions will matter to do that, to see an effect. Another example here as well, where friends of mine, specifically Professor Zijun Yao from the Institute of Atmospheric Physics in China, looked at some purple soils in the Chengdu region and applied different forms of fertilizer as well as different forms of nitrification inhibitors. So vegetable production systems are the most and highest fertilized systems globally, as well as having the most economic return in terms of productivity or income. What we see again is what we have seen, or we can see in several studies. Once we apply the fertilizer together with an inhibitor, here it's DMPP, we see a strong reduction in emissions of N2O and as well for NO, and which is not shown here. So this is true for the Chinese cabbage season as well as for the lettuce season. And overall, we see a significant effect again with regard to reducing the N2O emissions, which is higher as if you would, for example, apply biochar. The reductions, of course, again, the magnitude of the reductions in the emission, however, still varies. Again, it depends on weather conditions and as well on the fertilizer type applied. Nevertheless, it's always a significant reduction. What as well was mentioned before, if we only apply nitrification inhibitors without the simultaneous application of urease inhibitors, we see an increase in ammonia volatilization. This is, of course, of concern, and therefore we really need to look into that. We mostly apply both kind of inhibitors, urease as well as nitrification inhibitors. As well, this was mentioned, and it's really important as well. We see that if we apply inhibitors, all the studies clearly show there is a significant increase in crop productivity. However, this is around 10% about for different crops. It also varies as well. Gregor was already mentioned this study where I was involved in as well, and where we looked into summarizing all the data and literature which has been published on this topic, specifically as we wanted to look into which N2O mitigation options can we really recommend without any questions. And this is a meta-analysis of a meta-analysis. So which means as we have so many reports already available, we really need to do a meta-analysis of the meta-analysis, as there's hundreds and hundreds of publications about it. The most important one, which was also said before, is the only one where we really see something significant. Sorry, I was jumping too quickly. Where we see without any question a significant reduction in N2O emission is the use of nitrification inhibitors. Even for urease inhibitors, we have a significant amount of studies which show no direct effect on N2O. So the problem we have with that one is, yes, we surely know that nitrification inhibitors do reduce N2O emissions. They also seem to reduce nitrate leaching, even though we have not as many studies as before. However, we have a bit of an issue here as well. So we know that this is really a very positive effect with regard to environmental losses. If we only use nitrification inhibitors alone, we see the risk that this may lead to increased ammonia volatilization, which affects atmospheric chemistry as well as human health. However, the mitigation efficiency very much varies and depends on the site, the soil conditions, the weather, and the inhibitor and fertilizer combination used. This poses a bit of a problem for us, or specifically as well for my group who is working on models as well, because we would like to implement this kind of inhibitor effects in our biogeochemical models. Nevertheless, there needs to be a systematic review to explore all the total metrics for these conditions, and that has not been done because most of the meta-analysis we see are really focusing on the overall effect rather than on the effect with different soil types, pH values, etc., even though some studies are out. So combination remained unexplored. Incorporation of nitrification inhibitor effects in models are therefore a little bit complicated. In that one, which is of course something we would like to do, because we finally would say, okay, if 80% of the farmers would use nitrification inhibitors, we can model the effect and not only work with global numbers here. So moreover, if you really look into the literature on nitrification inhibitors and urease inhibitors, the focus was always on the cropping period. Importantly, of course, we know that the nitrogen stays in the soil, not all nitrogen is harvested. So which means we need more studies which also explore the nitrification, the use, what happens with the nitrogen which stays with the crops in the soil in the non-cropping period. This is still largely unexplored and possibly would deserve further research as well. And of course, this was something which was mentioned before as well. If we use nitrogen inhibitors or urease inhibitors, we increase nitrogen use efficiency of the crop. And this means as well, what has also not been done in many studies, change the use of fertilizer amounts. That would possibly also lead to much higher positive effects as so far communicated. Thanks a lot for your attention.
Thank you very much, Klaus. And I'm glad you mentioned the issue, let's say, the potential of combining nitrification inhibitors and urease inhibitors, because that's something, let's say, there are several questions on that topic in the Q&A box. So by the way, we have already received 17 questions, so which means we will have a quite busy Q&A part. And I invite the speakers to already look at the Q&A box. So now let's say the more regulatory part, and so Thomas Lepin is going to talk about inhibitors and, let's say, registration procedures related to inhibitors for their safe use. So over to you, Thomas. Well, you are muted, Thomas. We see your slide, but we can't hear you.
Yes, thanks. That's the classical mistake. Thank you, Patrick. I hope you can see the full presentation mode now.
Yes.
Yes, I want to talk a little bit about the regulatory framework for the safe use of inhibitors. And jumping directly through the agenda to the general categorization, the first thing I wanted to point out is inhibitors on European level. And what I tell you today is specifically related to European legislation. There's the fertilizing products regulation in Europe, which is still quite new. That was put into action in 2019. And the so-called FPR, fertilizing products regulation, specifically has inhibitors as product function category. This abbreviation PFC stands for product function category, and the European Commission put inhibitors in here as a specific category, especially for two reasons. First, they consider inhibitors as important to fertilization practice, as you could also sense from the presentations already given. And they are also considered as contributor to reduce environmental impact of fertilization and to increase nutrient use efficiency. That was pointed out as well already. Now, according to the Fertilizing Products Regulation, inhibitors can be applied either as standalone products under the so-called PFC5, but they can also be applied as part of a fertilizing product blend, which would then be, as you can see on the left-hand side here, PFC7. That would be a mixture of like mineral or organomineral organic fertilizer, PFC1, with an inhibitor of PFC5. And last but not least, there is a third option. You can also compose these products as a PFC1 fertilizing product and have an inhibiting compound as a compound of, or let's say as an ingredient according to the so-called CMC1, which would be component material category 1 in the Fertilizing Products Regulation. I know this is a bit complex. If you have questions on this, just get back to me on that and I can explain that a little deeper. So now coming to the preconditions for safe use of inhibitors. The most important regulation in terms of chemical safety, of course, in Europe is the REACH regulation. REACH stands for Registration, Evaluation, and Authorization of Chemicals. And when the REACH regulation entered into force in 2006, even the Los Angeles Times at that time brought out an article saying this regulation is probably the world's most stringent law ever. And that probably didn't change until today, since the REACH regulation includes extensive toxicological studies, including mutagenicity, repeated dose toxicity, reproductive toxicity, and ecotoxicological studies, including aquatic toxicity, degradation, environmental fate, effects on terrestrial organisms. And all these have to be done if you bring products in the market in high volumes, or you import them or produce them in very high volumes. But of course, for lower volumes, the REACH regulation goes down in its requirements. So it always depends on the production or import volume, what is required to be handed in to the ECHA, the European Chemicals Agency. And only after provision of such a comprehensive dossier, including, for example, a chemical safety report also for all substances which are produced and imported in Europe above the threshold of 10 tons, substances are registered and approved for specific uses. But now going further from REACH to the Fertilizing Products Regulation, the Fertilizing Products Regulation is even stricter than REACH. You won't imagine, but that is possible, since under the Fertilizing Products Regulation, it says even all substances, including substances within mixtures, must be registered according to Annex 8, including a chemical safety report. And that means basically that even if you produce or import substances in amounts or in volumes lower than 10 tons per year, you still have to register that according to the requirements for substances above 10 tons per year. And you also have to provide a chemical safety report, which, according to REACH, is only necessary for products above 10 pounds per year. So that can be found in CMC 1.2 if you're interested to look for that. And on top of that, a risk assessment is expected to be conducted prior to placing products on the market under the FPR. As you can see in recital 53 of the FPR, a risk assessment is described as precondition to bring products into the market under the FPR. And a central element which you can find in the FPR and which comes up again and again is EU fertilizing products shall not present a risk to human, animal, or plant health, to safety, or to the environment. This can be found firstly in Article 4.2 in the product requirements, but it can also be found 13 times more in the core text of the regulation. So the risk assessment is definitely an obligatory element of the FPR. Then, of course, in terms of a risk, you do not only have the risk of the potential risks for human health, the environment, etc., but of course also the risk that the product you receive does not fulfill the expectations you have. And for this, the Commission in 2020 asked CEN, that is the European Agency for Standardization, to draw up harmonized standards as methods for testing. For example, for testing of the content of the inhibiting compound in fertilizers, or even more important, to test the efficacy of an inhibiting compound in fertilizers. And for this, in 2022, the first technical specifications, these are documents out of which the harmonized standards are developed. They were published in 2022, but the first harmonized standards on fertilizers and inhibitors are only expected for July 2027. So it's still a longer way to go until we have these harmonized standards finally in place. So then coming to conformity assessment, for every product you want to bring into or on the European market through the fertilizing products regulation, you have to go through the so-called conformity assessment. For simple products like simple fertilizers, you can do that through the so-called module A. You find that here on the left-hand side. And for these, you do not need the help of an external conformity assessment body, a so-called notified body. But for products that are more complex, like inhibiting compounds, inhibitors, you need to go through the so-called modules B plus C, or alternatively through module D1. And what you can see here, it's necessary to go through module B plus C for products according to the product function category 1 to 6. And this, of course, also includes PFC5. Yes, this is that so far. I think I have to hurry a bit. Then, of course, in terms of conformity assessment, if you go through conformity assessment according to that module B plus C, that means your product must be checked on, evaluated by an external notified body. Then you have to provide the so-called technical documentation. You have to provide documents that are then externally evaluated, and only after that you are allowed to bring your product on the European market with a CE mark. And the documents you have to provide are, for example, the description of the product, the PFC, the product function, that means PFC5 or PFC1 plus PFC5, for example. You have to provide a list of all component materials and CMCs. That also includes information on REACH, and that means information on REACH for every single component in your final fertilizing product, or which also means for every component within your inhibitor. So that's necessary here. That's really very, very exhaustive. You have to provide drawing schemes of the manufacturing process, analytical test reports, specimen of the label, the list of applied standards or harmonized standards for that, and of course results of examinations. And the results of examinations also in
Okay, Thomas, we lost you for about 30 seconds. If you could go back, let's say, in your presentation slightly. We lost you for, let's say, almost a minute. Okay, so it looks like, let's say, Thomas was very close to the presentation.
I am back. I am back.
Yep.
Yes,
Back.
you are back, Thomas.
I'm sorry. I have some problems, obviously.
Yes,
I
it
don't
was
know
in
where
the middle of your last but one slide that we lost you.
the middle of conformity assessment.
Yes, it was
Okay.
in the middle of that one.
Okay, so let me once again start there. I'm not sure. Wait a second. I will once again share that screen. I hope the last two slides will work out now as well. Sorry about that.
Yes, we can see it.
I hope you still heard that I said the list of all component materials and CMCs must be provided. That also includes all REACH information and specifically or especially REACH information, not only on the product itself, but of course of every single ingredient or component in the product. That also means in your inhibitor, for example, or inhibiting compound. You also have to provide drawing schemes of the manufacturing process, analytical test reports, specimen of the label, the list of the applied or by that harmonized standards, and results of examinations. And results of examinations also includes the results of your risk assessment, which you have done. And finally, labeling. As I told you earlier, that you have the choice to bring your product into the market either as a PFC5 inhibitor, or you can also say, okay, I apply the inhibiting compound already on my PFC1.
Oh, again frozen.
Take into account requirements. For example, for a PFC1 fertilizer with inhibiting compounds, you have to state the word nitrification inhibitor or urease inhibitor on your label. The content of the inhibiting compound must be expressed as a percentage by mass of the total nitrogen content in the form of ammonium or urea or urea. For PFC5 inhibitors, then you have to specify the content of the inhibiting compound. And you have to give use instructions, including the types of fertilizing products the inhibitor may be applied to, and the recommended.
So, Thomas, we miss you again, but we have received your message, and let's move to the last presentation, because that's the third time we lose you now. So
maximum content.
Yes, Thomas, we have problems, let's say, following you. Your connection doesn't seem to be very good. So could you, thank you for your presentation, and let's move to the last presenters. Thank you, Thomas, and we will come back to you with questions probably. And thank you for, let's say, at least describing something that is very complex in the European Union in terms of registration and regulation. So let's move to the last presenter of today, David, and David Cantor. David, you are to tell us about, let's say, what could be policy incentives for stimulating, let's say, greater adoption of inhibitors. Over to you, David.
Thank you. Hopefully you can see my slides and hear me okay.
Yes.
Thank you for the
Everything is okay.
invitation. So I will briefly talk about some of the existing programs or kind of types of programs and policies that exist to incentivize inhibitor uptake, and then some potential options, perhaps more creatively to do so, and then zoom in on one particular option that we wrote about a few years ago that could be used to incentivize greater uptake. So in terms of existing approaches, I've kind of tried to categorize them. It's not always perfect, but just to give you a sense, there are programs, for example, that try to financially incentivize the uptake of inhibitors. So, for example, one of the incentive programs in the United States, the U.S. Department of Agriculture, EQIP, provides financial assistance to cover the additional costs of incorporating inhibitors, for example. Then you have mandates where you have certain countries mandating, or at least partially mandating, the use of inhibitors with fertilizers. So, for example, Germany now with urea either mandates that urea needs to be incorporated with inhibitors or integrated with the inhibitors or incorporated directly into the soil. Obviously, we have India's neem coated urea policy. Neem is not an inhibitor per se, but just as an example of a kind of mandate for their use of inhibitors. And then finally, what I've called kind of competitions, right? So government-sponsored prizes for fertilizer innovation. And again, there's been an example of this in the United States where the US Department of Agriculture and the Environmental Protection Agency have collaborated together on this next generation fertilizer innovations challenge. I think this is especially interesting and important because inhibitor technology, even though it's exciting, is has been around for a while. And more generally in the fertilizer industry, because of the very nature of an essential nature of the nutrients that are provided, there is not as much of a need for innovation on the product side as perhaps there would be, say, in the pesticide or GMO industry. And so any initiatives to try and incentivize innovation and competition could be very interesting. In terms of other options potentially for stimulating adoption and innovation, one would be to change how we think about compensating crop advisors. Many crop advisors obviously are advising farmers on how much and what kind of fertilizer to use, but they're often compensated based on the quantity of fertilizer sold. And so this idea of transitioning, and this has been written about a lot, but transitioning towards more service-based compensation and then more integrating advice around inhibitors to farmers. There's also been a lot of talk around how we might tie in crop insurance or agricultural insurance more generally as a carrot to get farmers to adopt inhibitors more. So, for example, lowering crop insurance premiums for farmers using inhibitors, the idea being that you are reducing a social damage, you are reducing the loss of nitrogen to the environment, which is a social benefit, and you are also increasing farmer resilience to things like floods and just climate change in general and extreme weather events by keeping more of the nitrogen on the farm. And so there is kind of an economic argument for lowering crop insurance premiums. Looking beyond the farm, in places like Europe, there are new due diligence requirements where multinational corporations are more responsible for tier 3 emissions, so emissions and environmental losses that go throughout their entire supply chain. And so you have companies like Unilever, for example, and others that already have sustainable supply chain codes mandating more sustainable nitrogen management. And one could imagine that a condition, say, of a farmer or a co-op contracting with a multinational corporation is the use or optional use of inhibitors as one example, right? And then finally, and the one that I'll dive a bit more into now, are fertilizer performance standards, where you could imagine imposing nitrogen use efficiency standards or nitrogen loss standards on fertilizer products, where it is the fertilizer industry that is essentially legally responsible and not farmers. And the idea behind that particular argument, and I'll dive into it very briefly now, but is kind of inspired by fuel efficiency standards for cars. We see those in the United States and in Europe and elsewhere. And the idea behind these standards is to say, instead of regulating the driving habits of millions of drivers, regulating car companies so that drivers, when they purchase a new car, have no choice but to drive a more fuel efficient car. And so when we did this study a few years ago, myself and Tim Searchinger, we asked ourselves, well, what would this look like in a fertilizer context? Well, in addition to whatever programs you have trying to incentivize farmers to adopt more efficient nitrogen practices and technologies, you regulate or force innovation in a sector to try and get these companies to produce more fertilizers that include inhibitors or next generation inhibitors, right? And these policies tend to work when industries are highly concentrated, and we see that. We were focusing in North America, and the North American fertilizer industry is highly concentrated when it comes to urea and ammonia production capacity. And I'm happy to get into this more in the details of the study if there is time or if people are interested. You know, we looked at some of the major players in the North American fertilizer industry, and obviously around the world, many companies are either producing products or services that enable farmers to use nitrogen more efficiently. And the idea being that with these kind of a focus on these performance standards, that it would really advantage first movers to be able to capitalize on a market for more sustainable nitrogen management. And the kind of the link here, and one of the echoes that we look to, for example, is the connection to the ozone story. If you look back to the Montreal Protocol, the International Environmental Agreement that protected the international ozone layer and that banned CFCs worldwide, DuPont was the major producer of CFCs, ended up being very supportive of the Montreal Protocol, not because they had a kind of come to Jesus moment where they realized, you know, they needed to be on the right side of history, but because they also produced the alternatives to CFCs that were patent protected that they could charge a premium for, right? And they actually capitalized. It was a massive market opportunity for them because the Montreal Protocol provided a global level playing field for these new products and global demand for these new products, right? And so there is a significant economic opportunity for fertilizer companies that produce these products as we move towards a world that is more focused on nitrogen policy and nitrogen management. We've seen the emergence of these targets of halving nitrogen losses to the environment in the EU, in the global biodiversity negotiations in UNEA. And so companies that are able to capitalize on that demand, the earliest will be able to really take advantage. So I'll leave it there and leave time for discussion and Q&A. Happy to take any questions. Thank you very much. Oh, and you're muted, Patrick.
Yes, good point. Thanks a lot, David. Thanks a lot to our 6 speakers. And so we have about 15 minutes for Q&A. We have received more than 20 questions, and I will start with some global questions. So some questions address issues that we have already discussed, so I'm not going to ask them again. And then, if time allowing, I will go to more, let's say, national specific, country specific questions. So questions to that's about urease inhibitors. So do you have and that would be then more for, in that case, for Matthias. Do you have experience in the use of humic acids or humic substances for coating urea in order to reduce volatilization due to the, let's say, the impact on the pH stability?
Thank you. Great question. I personally don't have that experience, but there's research showing that you got to be careful with the humic substances, particularly on their pH. Also, there's a wide range of products being called humic substances, so it's a wide question in that sense. There's research coming from Brazil, where actually adding humic substances to urea increased volatilization due to the pH effect. So it will depend a lot on the pH. And one thing is what happens on the soil pH in general when you apply humic substances versus what happens when you coat urea with one of those. So that's a watch out to have.
Still a question to you, Matthias. Does duramide break down if it is blended with phosphate?
What we have seen is that it maintains performance, efficacy in blends. For example, with MAP, we did some studies and we showed that, and we showed a better performance than MBPT alone in that sense. As I said, duramide is a more resistant molecule and has shown that kind of performance of being able to reduce volatilization in blends, for example, with urea treated with duramide plus MBPT, blended with MAP. in comparison to just NBPT.
Still for you, Matthias. What is the mechanism of urease inhibitors in decreasing N2O emissions?
I think it was mentioned during the presentation that even though the urease inhibitors are not a nitrification inhibitor, we're slowing down let's call it the release of the pulse of ammonium into the soil, and we're slowing a little bit the hydrolysis of urea, and that's probably one of the mechanisms. The direct mechanisms are not so well understood as they are understood for nitrification inhibitors. So that's a little bit of a gap, but to me, the easy way to understand it is like we're reducing the pulse of ammonium immediate in the soil as we compare urease inhibitors versus fertilizer not treating with these urease inhibitors.
So I'm following questions in chronological order. So that's why that's mostly for you at the beginning, Matthias. There are two questions about the shelf life of, let's say, stabilized fertilizers. So one is, how far are we to get a longer shelf life for urease inhibitors, regardless of the environmental conditions? And the other one, you may want to respond to the two of them, and maybe Gregor can also elaborate on that one. What is the shelf life of the inhibitors? And must it be applied close to application? Or let's say, can they be applied already at manufacturing? And what does it mean, let's say, during the whole, let's say, transportation journey from the manufacturing plant up to the farmer?
Yeah, so a lot of questions there, complex questions, great questions. Let's say that good formulation of urease inhibitors, being that NBPT base or Duramide plus NBPT, you don't need to do it just in time per se. You don't need to do it like a few hours or a few days before the fertilizer is applied. For example, in Brazil, our customer is treating the fertilizer between the moment of application and the fertilizer application, or the moment from treating the fertilizer to the fertilizer application, you can have months in between those or product that gets stored. So in that sense, maybe there's a misconception that urease inhibitors need to be applied almost like just in time. That's not necessarily the case. Then we have seen a longer shelf life for Duramide plus NBPT formulation on commercial name Amvol versus NBPT-based formulations in real-world studies where fertilizer is stored in fertilizer plants in Brazil under non-controlled environmental conditions, an extended shelf life of several months, more than a year between of increase in that. So in that sense, Duramide provides that enhanced shelf life. And as I mentioned, also when blended with fertilizers. The question of, I think there was a question about being able to ship from one continent to another, from a stability of the product, more stability, the performance, I would say, that can be done. There are many hurdles to do it. And there's also technologies that allow, as I mentioned very briefly in my presentation, most of the market is related to coating fertilizer or urea, for example, with these inhibitors. There's some technologies and we have one of those to be able to incorporate those inhibitors into the urea fertilizer as being manufactured, which potentially is a good solution for this. Today, that's very common because there are also, as we heard, significant hurdles from a registration point of view, from a logistic point of view, fertilizer having to segregate the treated versus non-treated. So it creates some complex situations to handle that beyond the pure technical point of view on performance of the urease inhibitor.
So you are in the base in Latin America. So could you tell us in Brazil, for instance, what is the share of the stabilized fertilizers where the inhibitors has been added at the manufacturing level or at the blending level? Do you have
Sure. Clearly, Patrick is at the fertilizer blender level. I would say that in contrast to, for what I know, not my area, but in the US, you see more application, more at the downstream, more into the retailer level. In Brazil, you have bigger fertilizer plants, blending plants, where part of the blending operation, they treat the urea with the urease inhibitors, our products or the competitors' products. That's the most of the market. The adoption of urease inhibitors in Brazil, you probably have better numbers than I do, but it's one of the largest ones, probably reaching close to 20%, between 15 and 20%, varies a lot. And I think there was a question of why are the drivers for the adoption in those countries. If I may take that question too, Patrick, very quickly. In Brazil, there's a big push for efficiency in the farm operations, And as probably everybody knows, a lot of no-till with surface applied fertilizer. So these are very big drivers, and conditions, the environmental conditions favor volatilization, and a lot of really good research coming from Brazil on the topic of agronomic in general, and particularly the use of inhibitors. So it's a combination of things that I think make Brazil a really leading case in the adoption of urease inhibitors, just purely from a farmer demand.
Thank you, Matthias. Let's move to Gregor about nitrification inhibitors. And at the end, we may take 5-10 more minutes than what we than initially scheduled. So when using nitrification inhibitors, does it, let's say, affect the target bacteria only involved in nitrification, or does it have an impact on other, let's say, bacterial species in the microbiome?
No, the active ingredients nitrification inhibitors have a very, very specific action only on the target organism, and there are a lot of research done if also so-called non-target organisms are affected. This is not the case. And also what was mentioned by Thomas in our REACH registration, we also have to conduct several studies if non-target organisms are affected or not. And this was not the case.
So, and there are several questions then about combinations of, let's say, different urease inhibitor molecules or nitrification inhibitors molecules, or combining urease and nitrification inhibitors. So could you elaborate about these combinations, and is it commercialized already? And is it really the way to go in the future if we want to really improve nutrient use efficiency and minimize ammonia and volatilization at the same time?
Yeah. So the combination of nitrification inhibitors and urease inhibitors makes only sense on urea-containing fertilizer, because only on urea-containing fertilizers, urease inhibitors make sense. So for standard ammonium nitrate-based fertilizer, it's not necessary. So we are talking about pure urea, and we are talking about UIN, the liquid urea-containing fertilizer. And here we know that there are also meta-analyzing doing this, that nitrification inhibitors, especially in urea-containing fertilizer, can increase ammonia losses. And with the addition of urease inhibitors, these ammonia losses can be reduced. But what is also important to know is that if we treat pure urea with a nitrification inhibitor, okay, we have higher ammonia losses, but below the line, the effect of the reduction of N2O losses outperform the increase of N2O emissions by the nitrification inhibitor. And the other topic is, from a, let's say, scientific point of view, a combination makes sense. This is not possible for every nitrification inhibitor and urease inhibitor, but industry is working hard on this, that this is possible. Also, we in BASF are working on this topic, and we will come with a new nitrification inhibitor soon, where the combination with urease inhibitor is possible. And then, of course, we have to look on the economics, because 2 active ingredients costs more than only 1 active ingredient. And of course, this will be then a challenge. But we are working hard on this topic. I know Matthias, his company has already such a combination with DCD and MBBT, but there are also other combinations on the market, and BASF will come soon also with a combination.
Yeah. But may I add, thank you, yes, Gregor, for the opportunity. Yes, and just to give an example, following up on what Gregor mentioned, like a few weeks ago, I was launching Tribune, which is a double inhibitor, nitrification and urease inhibitor, which contains pronitridine. Koch Agronomic Service developed nitrification inhibitor, in this case in particular for UAN. So just those, there are examples besides or in addition to what Gregor mentioned of other products in the market, as well as products where these inhibitors are incorporated in the urea production that also Koch Agronomic Services markets in North America. Thank you.
Thank you. And another question to the two of you probably is, let's say, there is, let's say, much better adoption of inhibitors in the US and Brazil than in the rest of the world. Let's say in the case of urease, inhibitors can be explained compared to West Europe because they use mostly urea, which is not used or little used in West Europe. Is that also linked to agroecological conditions, or is it because of the regulatory context as well? How can we explain that much higher, let's say, adoption in the US and in Brazil? Do you have any idea?
So
go ahead, Gregor, please.
So, for example, if you look into Europe, urea is one important nitrogen-containing fertilizer, but we also have in Europe ammonium nitrate and calcium ammonium nitrate, and we have the opposite in, for example, in Brazil and in US, where the portion of urea is much higher in the total volume of nitrogen-containing fertilizers, and so then if you use here an urease inhibitor, of course, then you have a higher market share compared to Europe or especially Germany, where most of the fertilizer is sold as non-urea containing fertilizer.
Yes, and as I said earlier, I think in Brazil there are a lot of agroecological conditions, combination with farmer practices, no-till, high temperature, and that promote volatilization. In both countries, a good public-private extension service that has understood the problem of volatilization and communicated benefits of urease inhibitors, and I think a very well-developed fertilizer industry. So I don't think there's just one factor that can explain it. In the case of Brazil, really there is no, beyond for the farmer benefit and the profitability that they see, other regulations per se, incentivizing heavily the use of inhibitors. And as David mentioned, there's some of those tools to promote adoption in the US. That when we talk about urease inhibitors, when we talk about nitrification inhibitors, completely different story, right? I mean, today it's a very, very small market in Latin America overall on nitrification inhibitors, and I think there's a great opportunity for farmers first to adopt this tool.
So questions, I don't know, the two of you and maybe Klaus as well. So should future research on inhibitors focus on new molecules or rather on, let's say, new formulations for molecules that are already in the public domain?
Yeah, it's always we look on both topics, new formulations to reduce the costs of the product, but also looking, of course, for new active ingredients to be more efficient, or to have, let's say, a better, greener profile concerning tox and ecotox. There are on the market active ingredients which can be improved concerning this topic. So the development of new active ingredients is not only looking on the biological action, it's a lot of other important topics. One is formulation, one is tox and ecotox, one is production costs, one is IP, of course, also. So it's a big bundle of different targets which must be optimized.
So there is a question as well on biological nitrification inhibitors. What are your thoughts on the topics? I don't know, Gregor or somebody else, or Klaus, or?
Yeah, I may say, I think, we know that some sorghum extracts, for example, can be used as biological nitrification inhibitors, and there's surely a lot of that as well still uncovered in the moment where we can possibly look into. And this is specifically important if you target organic farming. So they may not easily use a nitrification inhibitor if it's a synthetic one. So if you want to target the organic farming sector, you have to think about alternatives here as well. Maybe to the other question before, I think as we are talking about carbon credits here as well, which is one of the motivation, we need to better understand when are nitrification efficient inhibitors and urease inhibitors most efficient. So this variability coming from weather condition as well from soil properties, mainly it's pH, but also texture related. That should be explored because that is what is hampering us to put it in the models as well. And that is what you want to have. Finally, I would guess at least that we want to have a simple tool. What is the amount or the range of inhibition we may get under different circumstances? And that's what can be done. And this applies for synthetic as well as for biological inhibitors.
So biological nitrification inhibitor is really a very, very interesting topic. But one challenge is not for the part of organic farming, but in conventional agriculture, how to apply biological nitrification inhibitors. At the moment, the so-called synthetic inhibitors, we treat standard fertilizer with urease inhibitors or with nitrification inhibitors, and the farmer can apply the treated fertilizer as usual with his fertilizer sprayer. In case of the biological nitrification inhibitor, we need first a formulation. We have to register it and so on and so on. And in general, it's often a very complicated chemical structure. So production in a chemical plant is challenging also the costs. So there's a lot of work to do with this very interesting compounds. And also, of course, we have to look on tox and ecotox properties. We know that natural-based compounds are not often not harmful. They are often harmful. And so also this topic must be worked on.
Okay, and there are two questions as well on denitrification inhibitors. Are there molecules that, let's say, that can inhibit denitrification? And if so, why aren't they commercialized?
So there are several publications dealing with this topic, and there's also some patent applications. And also BASF has a denitrification inhibitor in his pipeline. But as I already mentioned, not only the biological effect is important to introduce a product into market, it's a lot of other topics which must be solved before we can introduce it into market.
And question to Thomas about, let's say, a regulatory issue. So you explain how complicated it is in the European Union. Is that as complex in the US and Brazil, which are the two main, let's say, markets?
Oh, to be honest, Patrick, I think there are others, like, for example, Gregor, who can probably give a better answer on that than I can. Because I personally am very much involved with Europe, and I cannot really say so much about the US or Brazil. Or maybe Matthias can say something about that.
Matthias in Latin America, for instance.
Yeah, sure. I can answer with better knowledge for Latin America. No, it's not as complex as what Thomas shared in Europe for Europe as it is for Latin America. There's a lot of variability among the Latin American countries. Some countries require very little, like, for example, the registration in the country of origin. Some countries require some additional information. on some of the topics that were mentioned before, like toxicity or when information developed elsewhere. And some other countries, for example, Brazil requires some measure of efficacy for registration. So it varies a lot, but in comparison, based on what Thomas shared, the hurdles for registration are simpler or lower for Latin American countries overall in general than what it was shared for Europe.
And there are several questions about, let's say, with inhibitors, we minimize emissions, losses. We can optimize nutrient use efficiency. And so many people, let's say, ask, of course, by how much we can increase yield. You refer to 6% on average, if I remember well, for urease inhibitors, Matthias. And as well by how much potentially can we reduce nitrogen fertilizer applications without impacting yield. So for both, let's say, if you, Matthias, or let's say Gregor or Klaus.
My own personal point of view is like that's a very delicate topic.
Yes, yes.
A yield increase, you know, with the current application rates, reducing rates is something that has to be done with very careful knowledge of local management practices and almost going to the field level. So there is potentially a potential for reducing those rates, but something that has to be done very carefully. And we cannot say, you know, if you use this, reduce your N rate by, you know, whatever kilos of nitrogen per hectare. That would be, I would say, not very responsible. What we are seeing consistently, and in the results I showed, for example, for our new formulation, is always comparing at the same nitrogen rate, because we think that there's, you know, that's a driver for farmers, at least in our region, a yield increase. Gregor, in case you want to add something, I'll make it quick.
Yeah, so I would like to answer as normally every agronomist answer, it depends how much we can reduce nitrogen amount. So first of all, where are we on the nitrogen response curve is the important thing. And if we here in the optimum then perhaps we can reduce the amount of nitrogen. But on the other hand, we also have to think from a farmer side, what is from a farmer economical more interesting? And based on our evaluation of our field experiments, for the farmer it's most interesting to have a higher yield and not to save money due to the reduction of nitrogen. Because for higher yield, he gets more money, then he will save money with a reduced nitrogen amount. But I fully agree with Matthias. It's a delicate question. It depends from situation to situation.
I'm an agronomist by the record, Gregor, so I was about this close to say it depends.
I think that's normal for scientists, and it's never black and white. There are a lot of shades of gray. So, and maybe last question, and then let's say we will have to close that webinar. So in order to increase uptake, do you think there is a need for a bigger marketing push or financial support, let's say, whether that's carbon market or others to really, let's say, trigger wider adoption of inhibitors for all the reasons that we explained about improving nutrient use efficiency, increasing yield, reducing N2 emissions? So do we need, let's say, be more, let's say, more ambitious in terms of marketing, in terms of developing incentives? And should we do that with, let's say, policymakers or other partners? Maybe David, you would like, as let's say, INI chair, respond on that one.
Well, I won't speak on. I'll speak on my own personal behalf rather than on behalf of INI. But yes, I mean, I think, to be honest, the only way I see, I mean, there has been some significant uptake. For example, in the United States, in a 10-year period, they just released this a couple of years ago. Went from like 5% of US cropland using inhibitors to over 25%. So there have been some success stories here. But I also think that, you know, whatever marketing strategies do need to go hand in hand with policy, that there is a ceiling on what can be done without a driver. And that policy can be both, a mixture of carrots and sticks, both in terms of providing long-term investment visibility for private companies to know that there is going to be a payoff to innovation and to continuing research and development in these fields, but also to have ambitious environmental targets where these kind of technologies are going to be needed, right? Again, if it's just about voluntary adoption because, there are these potentially marginal yield increases, that's you're going to reach a ceiling of first adopters pretty quickly. And if you want to see them be more widely adopted, you are going to need to see things like the nitrogen loss targets, the nutrient loss targets in the farm to fork strategy in Europe and elsewhere really have some bite to them.
Okay. So I think it's time now to close that webinar. We are 15 minutes behind. So a big thank you to everybody. Stabilizers, whether urease or nitrification inhibitors, is a well-known technology. It's here now for decades, but it is also a promising technology, especially with new molecules, new formulations arriving on the market. There are also, let's say, I hope there will be many, there are many others in the pipeline that we will see in the next 5 to 10 years. Of course, as mentioned before, we need, let's say, a wider adoption of these products. Let's follow the example in the US and Brazil, even if agroecological conditions are different, even if the nitrogen fertilizer mixed with much more urea than, for instance, in West Europe, explains the different adoption rates. Something that we have not talked about is really also the benefit of these products, especially nitrification inhibitors, were for in the case of livestock manure. So these products can be used as well to minimize, let's say, N2 emissions in the case of livestock farming. We should, and we are working on it at the moment at IFA, on look at inhibitors in relation to, let's say, carbon credits. And so we are working with, let's say, our main member companies that have an inhibitor business to develop a mechanism that would, let's say, make it possible for farmers using inhibitors to benefit from carbon farming, which would be a way to, let's say, basically subsidize the use of inhibitors. But that would be a market-driven mechanism in that case. So that's something we are working on, and that will be presented to our board of directors next week at our, let's say, annual meeting. And so with this, I would like, let's say, thank you, our 6 speakers. Thank you to Hakim, Matthias, Gregor, Klaus, Thomas, and David. Thank you also to all our participants. We had up to 160 people online with us. They have asked more than 30 questions, so that was very dynamic, let's say, Q&A. Unfortunately, there are still 10 questions that have not been answered. And with this, okay, the replay will be available online. So feel free, and we encourage you even to disseminate the information and the link for the replay to your colleagues and to your network. And that will be on our website for, let's say, on our webpage for podcast and webinars. With this, thank you very much. Thank you, everybody. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you, Patrick. Thank you, Margot. Thank you, colleagues. Have a nice day.
Likewise.